10 o'clock here on NPR News. You're listening to 91.1 FM KNOW, Minneapolis, St. Paul. You can stream us anytime you like at nprnews.org. Check that website out. We've got video you can watch. We're doing a live call-in show hosted by Catharine Richert coming up next at 8. You can check out videos, nprnews.org. In the Twin Cities, temperatures falling to about 14 tonight. Tomorrow it's going to be much warmer, highs in the low 40s.
I'm Catharine Richert. You're listening to NPR News. Last night's State of the Union speech was one of the longest in recent history, an hour and 47 minutes to be exact. President Donald Trump talked about everything from the economy to fraud of public programs in Minnesota, and he even brought out the men's gold-winning Olympic hockey team for recognition. Despite all of the ground that he covered, Trump didn't announce many new policies. So tonight we'll talk with two politicos who follow Minnesota and national politics, policy, and law closely about last night's speech, what stood out and what was missing. And we want you to join our conversation. What was your biggest takeaway from last night's State of the Union? What moments stuck with you? How did the president's description of the country match what you are experiencing? Call us at 651-227-6000 or 800-242-2828.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Ryland Barton. Secretary of State Marco Rubio defended the Trump administration's ambitions during a visit with Caribbean leaders. The meeting with the Caribbean Community Bloc comes after the U.S. deposed Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The military action has created an energy crisis in Cuba, which relied heavily on Venezuelan oil.
The people of Cuba are suffering today. They've been suffering for a long time. They're suffering now, perhaps more than at any time in recent memory, perhaps in the history since 1959. This is the worst economic climate that Cuba has faced, and it is the authorities there in that government who are responsible for that.
Mexico and Canada have been sending aid shipments to Cuba. His trip came as Cuba's government announced that its soldiers killed 4 people aboard a speedboat registered in Florida. Cuban officials say the boat's occupants opened fire on officers in Cuban waters. Rubio said the U.S. is gathering its own information on the incident. Federal regulators have issued citations and fines to 3 businesses for failing to protect 6 workers who died by toxic gas exposure at a northern Colorado dairy last year. Emma Vandeninde of member station KUNC has the details.
The Occupational Safety and Health Administration says the dairy, a local dairy equipment servicer, and a local contractor failed to train workers properly on how to detect toxic gases. The fines between the 3 businesses add up to nearly $250,000. Ryan Spear is an attorney representing the families of 4 of the deceased workers.
If we're going to compare those fines to a life, they are wholeheartedly a drop in the bucket. And I think that the family members are more concerned with how to ensure that these types of accidents do not happen again.
Spear says the families are still waiting on answers on what exactly happened at the dairy and why. For NPR News, I'm Emma Vandeninde in Greeley, Colorado.
The microchip company Nvidia reported record sales and profits last quarter that were nearly double what they were at the same time last year. The company's an AI bellwether, and as NPR's John Ruich reports, the strong earnings could help ease fears of a bubble.
Nvidia has become the world's biggest company by selling the most coveted chips for artificial intelligence data centers. The company says last quarter its sales grew 73% year on year, and its profits leapt 94% to $43 billion. This comes at a time when markets have been jittery about whether major spending on AI across the industry will translate into profits. Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang says AI has fundamentally changed computing, and spending on it is the path to profit and growth. But his company is under immense pressure. Nvidia's share price popped in after-hours trading following the earnings report, but quickly slipped back to about where it was before. John Ruich, NPR News.
U.S. stocks rose today and erased their losses for the week so far. The S&P 500 gained more than 0.75%. This is NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Joyce Foundation, committed to advancing racial equity and economic mobility for the next generation in the Great Lakes region. Learn more at joycefdn.org. This is NPR.
For NPR News in the Twin Cities, I'm Elena C. President Donald Trump did not mention the federal immigration operation in Minnesota during his State of the Union address last night. Trump spoke more broadly about immigration and border security as he addressed a joint session of Congress. But at other gatherings yesterday, Democratic officials from Minnesota, including Congresswoman Angie Craig, renewed their criticism of the White House's surge of federal agents to the state.
We've heard them over the past 2 months as he and his administration have tried to sell the narrative that Operation Metro Surge was intended to keep our communities safe, intended to keep and get violent criminals off our streets. We know that isn't the case.
Craig's guest for last night's speech was the son of a Minnesota woman who self-deported to Mexico after being detained by ICE. She said the operation caused trauma for him and for many other Minnesota residents. Minnesota will lose $259 million this month in Medicaid funding as part of the Trump administration's crackdown on fraud. Vice President J.D. Vance announced today that he believes the withholding will not hurt the people of Minnesota due to the state's, quote, rainy day fund.
What we want to see from the governor of Minnesota, from the entire administration there in Minnesota, is some affirmative steps to make sure that the people who are billing us for Medicaid services are actually providing those Medicaid services.
Vance says some of the funding cuts will be to a program meant to give kids with autism access to after-school services due to reported fraud. Minneapolis police are investigating after a man was fatally shot last night. It happened just after 10:30 inside an apartment building near Stevens Square Park. Authorities say officers responding to reports of a shooting found the man dead in a first-floor common area of the building. Police say it appears there was an altercation before the shooting. No arrests at last report. Checking temperatures around the state, 20 in St. Paul, 12 in Duluth, Rochester reporting 21, the cold spot at this hour, 5 in International Falls. This is NPR News.
Programming on NPR News is supported by the University of Minnesota, conducting research today which will shape healthcare in Minnesota tomorrow. Search Minnesota's healthcare leader.
Programming is supported by Minneapolis Radiation Oncology. The radiation specialists at MRO fight brain tumors using HyperArc technology with pinpoint accuracy. Learn more at mropa.com.
Good evening. I'm Catharine Richert. You're listening to NPR News. President Donald Trump gave a long State of the Union speech last night, clocking in at an hour and 47 minutes. He really covered a lot, from the economy to fraud investigations in Minnesota to a surprise appearance by the men's Olympic gold medal hockey team. And as it is so often the case these days, there was a lot of political theater, too. But even though the speech was long, Trump was short on details about new policies. Presidents before him have often used this annual speech to lay out what voters can expect next. So tonight, we're going to sort through all of it with two guests who follow Minnesota and national politics closely. We'll talk about politics and policy and law, what stood out and what was missing from last night's speech. And we want you to join our conversation. What was your biggest takeaway from last night's State of the Union? What moments stuck out to you? How did the president's description of the country match what you are experiencing? You can give us a call at 651-227-6000 or 800-242-2828. Now I'm going to bring in my guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Chris Geidner. He is the publisher and author of Law Dork. That's a newsletter that covers legal developments from the Supreme Court to the Trump administration to state and federal trial courts. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
Hello.
And then we have with us in St. Paul, Amy Frederiksen. She specializes in media relations and crisis communications and is a principal for Momentum Advocacy. That's a Minnesota-based lobbying firm. She's been a Republican political strategist and was the first woman to serve as state Senate Majority Leader in Minnesota. Amy, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Catherine.
All right. So, Chris, I want to start with you. This was not a typical State of the Union. What stuck out to you the most about President Trump's speech last night?
Yeah, I mean, it is, first of all, thanks for having me. Glad to talk with all of you in Minnesota Public Radio. You've been doing great work over the past several months that I've been very reliant on. So thank you.
Thank you.
I will say, I mean, it was a strange State of the Union on just the level that you were talking about, because he traditionally, the president goes to the State of the Union to tell Congress what he wants them to do this year. And we, aside from a couple of small things, that's not really what we got. We got when he wasn't being sort of just an aggressive racist, he was bragging about either what he had done or what he believes he can do, like with tariffs, without any further action from Congress. And so it was a really unusual State of the Union to try and gauge what it is that he thinks needs to happen this year, which is what a president's supposed to do.
Yeah, so no marching orders, it sounds like, for Congress. Amy, what about you? What stood out to you the most?
Well, I mean, aside from the length, which with this president should surprise no one any longer, I think it is an interesting take on. This wasn't so much about his vision for the country, but maybe trying to sort of lay down facts and make a case for how the country should view him. And I think in that way, he missed a lot of opportunities, because I think a lot of Americans are worried about the economy and affordability. And he openly is sort of disdainful of that word. But yet it is consistently something that comes up in polls as, you know, a top concern for Americans. He's not getting the high marks that he has traditionally gotten on economy. And so I think he can sort of, you know, a little bit like former President Biden, you can't ignore or pretend to the American people. You're kind of asking them to believe something that is, you know, different than what's right in front of them and what they're seeing on their pocketbook and what they're seeing around the family table. And so, you know, in that way, I think it was a bit of a miss. But then also, in true Donald Trump fashion, there was a lot of sort of drama and a lot of moments. There was a moment where he called out Congress to stand up if you believe that American citizens were more important than illegal immigrants. There was an interplay between the president and our own Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, and you know, in a variety of those moments. Plus, you know, the usual sort of political pomp and circumstance around special guests. He awarded 2 medals of honor. And so, you know, it had some of the usual hallmarks, and then it had, you know, some very Trumpian hallmarks to a State of the Union.
Well, you know, Amy, since you brought it up, we're going to play that clip. And again, just to set it up a little bit, you know, it's not atypical for the minority party in Congress to either like sit or not stand for certain lines or policy announcements during the State of the Union. But as you said, President Trump seemed to kind of use that tactic to his benefit at one point. And he asked the audience, you know, he said, quote, stand up if you agree that the first duty of the American government is to protect American citizens, not illegal aliens. That was a direct quote from him. Democrats predictably stayed seated. Republicans stood up and they clapped vigorously. And let's just play a clip of what happened next here.
Isn't that a shame? You should be ashamed of yourself not standing up. You should be ashamed of yourself. That is why I'm also asking you to end deadly sanctuary cities that protect the criminals and enact serious penalties for public officials who block the removal of criminal aliens. In many cases, drug lords, murderers all over our country, they're blocking the removal of these people out of our country, and you should be ashamed of yourself.
What our audience can't see or maybe hear very well there is that Minnesota Congressional Representative Ilhan Omar, a Democrat, was among those yelling, quote, "You have killed Americans," quote, "You should be ashamed." I mean, Chris, unpack this a little bit. This is political theater, and like we're still talking about it 24 hours later, right? So maybe that was sort of the point of the whole thing.
I mean, it was definitely political theater, but I think it was just that constant refrain that sort of like what Donald Trump does to institutions, to people around him, to circumstances like the State of the Union that we sort of rely on. And while you're right, like I think you pointed out perfectly the idea that, like, yes, it's sort of like a given that when the president announces a partisan goal of his, that the other party isn't going to be celebrating it. And clearly his speechwriters, and to the extent he was involved directly, were thinking about that when they wrote that line and planned to sort of attack the Democrats after it. And that's where it sort of goes off the rails from what we expect. And it's like one of the things beforehand that Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic House leader, was telling, it was reported that he had told his caucus, was basically like, be respectful in there, don't cause a scene. And like, it just feels so like not of what you knew was going to happen from Trump. And I think that is why Rep. Omar did respond in kind, because I was responding on Blue Sky last night. Like, it just felt unacceptable to me. Like, I'm not a rep. There's a reason why I've never been an elected official, would not want to be one. But like, I would not have been able to stand there if Trump was alleging the things about people, like personally sometimes, that he was. I would have left.
Yeah. And Amy, I mean, I'm wondering, like, does this also serve Democrats in a moment like this? You know, your job now is to focus on messaging and communications. I mean, on one hand, you could argue that Democrats should not have taken the bait here, but does it also serve them too?
Well, and I think they shouldn't have taken the bait, and that's indeed what it was. And Trump sort of thrives when he has a combative opponent, if you will. And that's what the line intended to evoke, and that's what it did. It's also Donald Trump trying to get back to what was once a very strength to his administration, which was the immigration issue. Illegal immigration was arguably what put him over the top when it came to the Biden administration, which by their own numbers had the number of illegal border crossings at unmanageable rates every day since Joe Biden was elected. So you circle that back. Donald Trump knew that. It's an issue that obviously he speaks a great deal about when he originally was talking about building the wall. And so that was a thing that sort of catapulted him in part to victory. And until Minneapolis, it continued to be a strong issue for him. But when you see what happened with Minneapolis, and you see that the handling of the immigration enforcement, 3,000 ICE agents, an operation that seemed disorderly, an operation that seemed dangerous for Minnesota residents as well as enforcement agents, and then indeed turned deadly. You saw the polls shift for the president, not just on the handling of it and not just on Metro Surge, but on immigration as a larger issue. And so this was an absolute calculated effort to sort of bring back the issue to where he is strong, which is, kind of on immigration written large, but also allowed a moment for our own Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar to point out and remind people about what happened with Metro Surge and sort of the disorder and deadly consequences of that enforcement action. So it's how it will play out is hard to know, right? We're how many months from an election, and it will play out differently in Minnesota than it will play out across the rest of the nation, I think.
Yeah. Well, and Chris, let's talk about that. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just the one thing I would add to that is that I think there's almost an additional negative that came out of it because of the fact that, like, while certainly Operation Metro Surge was the largest, it wasn't the first. And you actually do have like communities across the country, and if nothing else, people who know people or have family members who live in communities who have been affected, because at this point you have DC, you have Minneapolis, you have Chicago, you have Portland, you had the original efforts in Los Angeles, you had National Guard in Memphis, in Charlotte, in New Orleans at different times, ICE or National Guard. And I do think that sort of makes it so that things that might not have been as accessible to people, that they might have been able to say, oh, that's somewhere else. It's a lot harder to say when like we're on to like more than half a dozen cities where some version of this has been tried.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it was notable to me, at least, that he did talk about how he deployed the National Guard and federal law enforcement officials in a number of different cities and calling them a great success, like in New Orleans and other cities around the country. Did not mention Minneapolis or St. Paul when he talked about that, Chris.
No,
Go ahead, Amy.
he only mentioned Memphis and New Orleans because those were the two cities that have Republican governors who allowed their National Guard to be used. He didn't mention Los Angeles, Portland, Chicago, or Minneapolis, St. Paul, because the Supreme Court, even in the case of Chicago, basically said you need to hold off on these operations when they are not with the governor's approval.
Yeah. Amy, you wanted to jump in there?
Well, what I'm puzzled about too is that Minneapolis, represents, both politically, but also just for the kind of heart of our country, a low point for the Trump administration. And certainly in Minnesota, but I hear from people all over the country that kind of see and feel the hurt that happened in Minnesota. And I think in this, the president, made a real tactical mistake in, I miss Apprentice Trump, who used to have people that did a terrible job and he fired them. And I don't understand this need to sort of, I guess if I don't hold anyone accountable, then it didn't happen. And that just doesn't play well. I think that that when you have a situation like Minneapolis, where clearly the situation was, I think it's an understatement to say it was a terribly run operation. Again, I said it was disorderly, it was dangerous, and it was in the end deadly. Any enforcement agency worth their salt would have paused operations after the first shooting, and evaluated and investigated and changed their tactics. And that's not what happened. They doubled down. And the people that were responsible for that, the people that were calling the balls and strikes and calling the plays in Minneapolis, should have been held accountable. And then I think the president would have more of a leg to stand on and actually maybe even could talk about Minneapolis, right? But instead it's just sort of like, well, it never happened and no one did anything wrong, but also 2 Americans are dead.
Yeah. If you're just joining our conversation, we are talking about last night's State of the Union address with two people who watch state and national politics very closely. We want to know what your biggest takeaway was from last night's State of the Union, what moments stuck with you, and how did the president's description of the country match what you're experiencing right now? Give us a call at 651-227-6000 or 800-242-2828. We have Warren from Roseville on the line. Warren, what do you want to share with us?
Hi, thank you very much. I think the thing that really stood out in my mind is the glossy picture that he painted as our country never doing better, our wealth never being better, the stock market never being higher. If you look at what has happened during the chaos of his administration with tariffs and everything else changing every other day, for anyone who's made 9% in the stock market since he's become president, the value of the American dollar has decreased 10%. Inflation is 2.4%. So people are looking at their incomes and their savings. They're thinking they've made 9%. They've actually lost 3.4% of the value of their wealth since he's become president. No one talks about how he's just decimated our economy, the American dollar. Everyone's buying gold. The dollar's become increasingly unstable. So that was the thing that particularly bothered me.
Yeah,
I'm appalled.
And Warren, Warren, I hear you. I mean, I think, a lot of fact checkers were out right away when he was talking about the economy, saying, it's actually not as good as he's portraying it to be. Chris, though, I mean, he's got low approval ratings right now. There is an upcoming midterm election. Talking about the economy seems to be something he comes back to, even though confidence in what he's done for it doesn't seem very high right now. Is this a winning tactic, Chris, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is that, I mean, we saw it in the last election that and I mean, you also mentioned it, like you can't lie. Like people are waking up each day and are having to face the reality. And I think that is perhaps some of what we were also seeing with regards to the way that he was talking about immigration, that there is just so much of the bubble effect for what Trump is allowed to see, what he's given, what his close staff are telling him. He's like much more surrounded by loyalists this time. There are basically no institutional Republicans who are in his cabinet, let alone in the White House. And I think that as a result of that, like what he's telling us might be what he actually thinks. And that almost makes it more dangerous politically, not only for him, but for the Republicans in the House and Senate, who they are stuck between a rock and a hard place of not wanting to say anything about Trump for fear of him saying something on Truth Social about them at 2 a.m, or upsetting their constituents by claiming that things are great when they're not.
Amy, you've pointed out now that Trump didn't say much about immigration or painted a different picture about immigration. It sounds like you think that what has happened in the Twin Cities could hurt him politically, and obviously polling sort of suggests that. But what about the upcoming elections? I mean, do you think that, did you hear anything last night that might improve his approval ratings and reflect better on Republicans this fall?
Well, I think that the jury is out on the full impact on the midterms of Metro Surge, because in these fast-moving news cycles, just in November here in Minnesota, it seemed like Republicans were going to sweep everything. Fraud was everywhere. Yeah. And I would have told you we were going to have
attention spans these voters have.
Well, and also, news moves so quick and big news moves so quick. Right. So I think Democrats would make a mistake to think that this will carry through to the next election. It certainly will have an impact. I'm not sure to what level. I think a couple things that I saw. I think that, and I will give the president his due when it comes to international politics. I think that between Ukraine, Gaza, and even the operation in Venezuela, his team gets a lot of credit. And I think that on an international scale, and frankly, I didn't. What I wanted to hear more about was Iran, and I think that was sort of where he fell into.
Very surprised.
Me too.
Yeah.
Like, this is the State of the Union is typically if a president is potentially going to go to war or move in on an operation, right? This is the moment, the big stage for him to sort of lay out his case for it. And while he made a lot of references to, right, is it protecting our allies in the area? Is it to stop them from having nuclear weapons? Is it for the suppression of free speech that they're doing? Like, take your pick, right? There's a lot of reasons to not like the regime in Iran. But to make the case that Americans should go in there and risk their lives, I'm not sure that he made that fully. And in the past, I think, I think that he gets his administration rightfully, and maybe it's, in part the direction of Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others, that they have done a very, I'm just going to say, I think they've done a good job. I'm very pleased with what I'm seeing on an international level, except for this case, where I think a lot of Americans are going to be, potentially are concerned and potentially could get very concerned if action starts happening with Iran. And I don't know that the president made that case, and I was surprised he didn't take more time on that than he did, or that he didn't just be more clear on the case for potential action with Iran.
Yeah. I mean, Chris, what in the speech what were you surprised you didn't hear more about last night? Is Iran among them? What else was missing in your view?
I mean, I think that it was really shocking, and I referenced this at the top, but that there really was not a lot of, there was no laundry list to Congress. There was no, here are, traditionally, the president is going to go around the country after the State of the Union to the 5 key Senate races, the 5 key House races, districts where he wants to pump up and say this is the legislation we're going to get through before the midterms to show you why you need to vote to keep this trifecta that we have. And we got none of that. And I think the clearest sign that we got none of that was something that was sort of mocked a bit online, including by me initially, I'll be perfectly honest, when Mike Johnson afterwards came out and was in the rotunda there and told reporters that if Trump doesn't, if they don't keep the House and the Senate, and maybe worried about his own job, he said, particularly the House, if we don't keep the majority, that would be the effective end of the Trump presidency. And I think that was Mike Johnson realizing that the president didn't do the key thing that he could do with that speech politically, which is make the case for why they need to keep the trifecta this year and keep a House majority that's Republicans, keep a Senate majority that is Republicans. And instead, he just wanted to talk about himself and give his examples of why immigrants are bad. And so that left Mike Johnson to have to go out afterwards himself and start to make the case for connecting that House majority to Donald Trump's ability to succeed and to accomplish things in the last 2 years of his administration.
Yeah. I mean, Amy, did you see that clip that Chris is talking about from House Speaker Mike Johnson after the speech last night? And what do you make of his concern? It seems that they are at risk of losing power in the House.
Well, the House Republicans don't have a super wide majority. anyway.
Yeah.
And they certainly have always had, there's certain districts that are in play that are just, more in play than, say, in the Senate, where a third of the map is up every 2 years. And depending on which third of that map is up, it can be a better, map, is what they say, for Republicans. And in this case, the House is entirely up. They have a very narrow majority. And in these swingy districts, they've got to be watching the polls, and at this point are concerned. And as I said, I'm not sure that that's where we are, because 5 months ago, I would have told you we were in a very different position than we are currently. So I think that things are moving very quickly. But Speaker Johnson has to be concerned about that, because and ultimately the president should be concerned as well, because if he loses the majority, at least the majority in the House, now you're going to spend the last 2 years of his last his last four, sort of in a battle where he's being his members of his staff are being questioned or brought before Congress, where essentially any kind of initiatives that he would want to see are being held up, potentially appointees not moving forward, although he would likely still have the Senate. And so it could really, from a legacy standpoint as well, do a lot of damage to the second Trump presidency's his second cycle. And so winning that House should be a top priority for his White House.
Okay, so Amy, you're kind of alluding to the fact that voter sentiment changes quickly. The news obviously is changing so fast all the time. It feels like you're saying there's time to fix this between now and November. What do you think needs to happen between now and then?
Well, as I said, I think it was a total miss when the president didn't take some action on Metro Surgeon General in Minneapolis. But I also think that Minnesota is could be potentially a bit of an anomaly given the circumstances here. Also, though, in Minnesota, we have outsized amount of fraud, and that's also going to play into things as we move forward as well. And so one, I think that people are going to be watching Iran. I think internationally, that's going to be a big question mark for the president, and the handling of that is going to be very important. Something has to be done in a very real way to start getting the economy moving again. And that was also, I think, a big miss in the laundry list of things for Congress to do, is that the president should have outlined more of a plan. Instead, what we've got is, kind of his sweeping tariffs struck down by a Supreme Court, many of whom he actually appointed to the Supreme Court, and really, a statement, kind of a light statement about him by him to say, well, I think there are other tariffs that I can do. I can still do tariffs. I just, it's not this tight from the Supreme Court. But I don't think that's the answer that Americans want to hear when it comes to the economy. And I think that case will probably be the number one thing that I would, if I were advising the president, I would focus on. And it seems to be an area where they're just kind of trying to avoid a little, that they kind of want to go on the stock market and run on tariffs. And that's not what Americans are feeling is needed at this time. And in fact,
I want to go back to tariffs in a few minutes. Yeah, I want to go back to tariffs in a few minutes here, but I just want to remind our audience that if you're just joining our conversation, we are talking about last night's State of the Union address with two people who watch state and national politics closely. We want to know what your biggest takeaway was from last night's speech, what moments stuck with you, and how did the president's description of the country match what you're experiencing right now? Call us at 651-227-6000 or 800-242-2828. We have Mary in Mapleton on the line. Mary, what do you want to share with us?
So the first thing that struck me was I got a call from a Republican friend early in the speech where, he said something about those little girls who drowned in Texas. Yeah, maybe show a little empathy. But what I asked her was but did you hear any, we're doing this different, we've implemented these things, so there's warnings that we're not going to have little girls in flash flood plains in Texas or Arizona. It's like no answers to anything, no fixes to anything, but trading on these people's pain, I found just disgusting.
And Mary, was there anything else in this speech aside from that that really stuck out to you, either that you were happy to hear or that you weren't happy to hear?
Nothing happy to hear. I could go on about the tariffs. That is all going to come back and kick us in the derriere. We will add to the deficit, or the debt, not the deficit, the debt, because you cannot legally do this. Like I said, with the Supreme Court ruling, I think that whole H.R. 1, the big, beautiful bill, we are going to pay for that, but it is going to be small Americans paying for that when it was all based on tariff money.
Yeah. Well, Mary, thanks so much. I do want to turn back to this issue of tariffs a little bit more. A few days ago, as we've been kind of alluding to, the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs that President Trump imposed in a series of executive orders. And I think people were a bit surprised by that. And, as always, the justices were at the State of the Union last night. The president typically shakes their hand. President Trump did that last night. But then just a little bit into his speech, he said this. Here's what he said. Do we have a clip
and then
of...
just 4 days ago, an unfortunate ruling from the United States Supreme Court. It just came down. It came down. Very unfortunate ruling. But the good news is that almost all countries and corporations want to keep the deal that they already made, right, Scott? Knowing that the legal power that I, as president, have to make a new deal could be far worse for them, and therefore they will continue to work along the same successful path that we had negotiated before the Supreme Court's unfortunate involvement. So despite the disappointing ruling, these powerful country-saving, it's saving our country, the kind of money we're taking in.
So, Chris, I think the conventional wisdom right now is that the Supreme Court is going to support Trump's policies. Were you surprised by this decision?
The Supreme Court is supporting both a lot of Trump's policies and, more broadly, a very robust executive authority that comes out of a lot of the long-term goals from the Republican appointees on the court, and also sort of this just reality that they've been siding with him, especially on the shadow docket. But there were a handful of cases that were coming to the justices this term that were going to challenge that because they came up against either long-term established views of the court, Congress, and scholars across the board, or against the long-term priorities of the justices themselves. And the tariffs case was one of them. And it really was, as I think we saw from Chief Justice Roberts' opinion on Friday, a case that he saw as a pretty easy case, that this is just not the type of thing that's allowed under this law. And he did. And Trump's press conference on Friday trying to say I can do anything, there's all these other authorities, that was a footnote in Roberts' opinion. And the important thing is there's a reason why the White House didn't do that initially. It has time limits. It has some of the authorities have prerequisites that are required. Some of them are going to be limited in what countries they can be applied to. And so all of what Trump said on Friday was this combination of bluster and Donald Trump doesn't ever want to say he loses. And so what we're left with now is the Supreme Court got to establish itself again, that like Trump doesn't get to do whatever he wants. And now we're going to have a couple of other cases. We've got this case over whether he can fire a member of the Federal Reserve Board, Lisa Cook. And then we're going to have arguments later in the spring over the birthright citizenship executive order. And I think those are the three cases where I think, I mean, they were very skeptical of the Lisa Cook firing effort, and I think they will be skeptical of the birthright citizenship order as well.
So you see this maybe as a harbinger of future decisions to come here, Chris?
I think that this is going to be a rough term for the Trump administration. I think that there was a lot of effort to push things off in the first term. If you remember, they did hear an argument related to the birthright citizenship executive order, but it ended up being that decision over universal injunctions and whether you could go to court and get an order struck down across the nation. But this term, they're really having to face some of the ultimate answers on the questions, and we got our first sign on Friday that they are willing to put their foot down.
Yeah, Amy, what did you make of that decision?
Well, first of all, I always think it's interesting when one side or the other gets kind of up in arms over executive orders. Trump is not the first president to overuse executive orders. I will say consistently.
Right, it's sort of the presidential privilege to be able to do it, right? Yeah.
Let's just be consistent. Both Republicans and Democrats, Clinton, Obama, George Bush Sr., George Bush, George W. Bush, they all have overused that. And by the way, Congress, as the separate but equal of the three branches of government, should be the ones that are most up in arms because the executive orders have been overused, abused for many presidencies now, which means the power of the legislature, the elected body, is less. But we have the third branch of the government, the Supreme Court, that has stepped in and exercised their right. I actually thought the president was quite subdued about this decision. I thought we might hear more about it, and we didn't. He, as you said, he cordially shook hands when he came in. I think there was some questions about that, and then he registered disappointment, which is his right to do. But he didn't really belabor it, in my opinion, is particularly since the tariffs are really sort of the crown jewel of his, besides H.R. 1, which is, no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime. Other than that big piece of legislation, the tariffs have been, kind of the main part of his economic toolbox. And to have that gone now, he's sort of starting over. I thought he was fairly subdued on it, and correctly so. The Supreme Court gets to decide that.
And do you think that also had something to do with the fact that
the president? On Friday, let's be clear, Trump did say that Justice Barrett and Justice Gorsuch should be embarrassed and their families should be embarrassed. So, to what Trump said on Tuesday night, he didn't need to say as much because he had already given an absolutely ridiculous press conference from the White House on Friday.
Yeah. Well, and also, Amy, I'm just wondering, too, those tariffs haven't been very popular recently. Do you think he's just trying to, respond to some of the polling we're seeing?
No, there's always been mixed reviews on tariffs, from the very beginning, right? And particularly when you have some states like Minnesota here, where we're border states, we've got folks that, do agriculture in northern Minnesota, even across the Canadian border, right? They might have hogs on both sides of the border, and so it's always been a concern, and particularly for farmers, who are traditionally supporters of Trump's economic policies. But what has been surprising to me is that he has steadfastly refused to step down. Now, what he is claiming here is that he's, cut some deals with countries, and so the tariff, the sort of leverage of the tariff isn't as necessary, and that the countries that he's cut deals with have said they're going to, keep to those deals, and that, that may or may not be true. I'm just saying, like, I think for Republicans, if we're talking politics here, which is what we are going into the midterms, I think some other things are going to be need to put into place to sort of address what is happening in the economy, or it's going to seem as if they're sort of tone deaf, which was another failing of the Biden administration, where they kept just telling us that the economy's fine, you feel fine, it's really better than you think, and Americans just didn't believe it. And I think that the Trump administration is potentially going down the same faulty path.
If you're just joining our conversation, we are talking about last night's State of the Union address with two people who watch politics closely. We want to know what your biggest takeaway was from last night's speech, what moments stuck out to you, and how the president's description of the country matches what you're experiencing right now. Call us at 651-227-6000 or 800-242-2828. We have Lisa from Wadena on the line. Lisa, what do you want to share?
Hi. I have two takeaways. The first one kind of fits in with what you have just been talking about in regard to how President Trump acts with the other two branches of Congress. I feel like he acts like a king, and it reminds me why I have been at a couple demonstrations, the No Kings protests. He treats the Congress like they should be the cheering section, just cheering for whatever he wants to happen. With regard to the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, when they make a ruling, for example, this latest one with the tariffs, his immediate reaction is to find the first workaround instead of actually considering the seriousness of what they have decided. My second takeaway was that the end of the speech sounded like another iteration of manifest destiny, and I really find that doctrine really abhorrent. And this was.
Can you say more about what you heard there?
Yeah, it was like America. There's no frontiers that we cannot conquer. He mentioned the West, conquering the West, and like I said, that sounded like manifest destiny to me.
Yeah.
And
thanks so much, Lisa. Chris, how do you respond to Lisa's comments there, Chris?
Yeah, Lisa, thanks for calling in. I think the one of the things that I've written about at Law Dork previously is this idea that one of the things that I think the founders would be most surprised about by the situation we're in now, besides everything with Donald Trump, although I think they imagined a person like Donald Trump could try to become the leader of the country, is the way the other branches are by and large responding to him. And I mean, I always go back to in the Federalist Papers, James Madison wrote that one of the things that the Constitution did best was, he wrote, give those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. In other words, I mean, they were all talking about men at that time. And they just assumed all of the men in office would be jealously and zealously guarding their powers. Like I don't think they ever imagined that there would be a House Speaker and a Senate Majority Leader who would not be upset and going to court and shutting things down over sort of the impoundment that the Trump administration has made, where they just don't spend money that Congress has appropriated. The power of the purse is Congress's. That's their thing. And the fact that not only did Congress do nothing, but when one of the lawsuits challenging that from nonprofit organizations made it up to the Supreme Court on the shadow docket, the Supreme Court didn't stop it. And so there were two bites at the two other branches stopping it, and they didn't. And so I really do think that hits one of the nails on the head of what sort of historically would be seen as most surprising about this moment.
Yeah. I'm going to try to fit in one more call here from Wesley in Fargo. Wesley, what do you want to share with us?
Hi, I want to share that I think it's ridiculous that Congress is doing absolutely nothing to quell these widely unpopular tariffs. I think it's also ridiculous that we have all of these quote unquote deals with countries that, we can't seem to share or be more specific about because, quite frankly, I don't think any of them exist. It's also one of the most divisive presidents that we've had, unfortunately, the second time around, and, nothing's changing. We want to sit and throw insults and not really focus on anything other than our ideas of a plan. It's crazy that we keep focusing on this one facet of economic policy, and that's tariffs, again, despite the fact that they're widely unpopular and affect really just the consumer.
Well, thank you, Wesley. Amy, I want to go back to something we haven't really gotten to talk about yet, and we just have a few minutes left here, but it's this messaging around fraud, right? People are obviously experiencing the economy in a different way, but at least in Minnesota, what we're seeing Republicans do is talk about fraud both as an accountability issue, but also as, like your taxpayer dollars are not being spent well. And that message seems to be sticking here in Minnesota. I mean, do you think that is something that we're going to be hearing more of on a national level for the next few months?
Well, we should have. And honestly, had, the president sent 300 auditors to the state of Minnesota instead of 3,000 ICE agents, I think that he would be wildly popular in the polls. We have had billions of dollars, and there's different reports, but we can argue about whether it's $1.5 billion or $3 billion or $5 billion. It doesn't matter. It's too much. It's been going on for 8 years. There's been no accountability to the Minnesota taxpayers. There's been no conversation about the harm that the fraud does to the really hardworking folks that are actually trying to administer the programs for real. This was money stolen from kids with autism, homeless folks, from school lunch programs for children. Like the very worst of the worst were stolen from both the Minnesota taxpayers and the folks that were, actually in need of those services. And so I think the Republicans in Minnesota, rightfully so, continue to ride that issue. And also, by the way, we still, from the Walz administration, have no accounting for how it happened and what's being done to stop it after 7 or 8 years of the Walz administration being responsible. And so that is not a political issue for me. That's just we should be, as Minnesotans, horrified and be demanding answers. But again, as I said, if the Trump administration had sent in forensic auditors by the hundreds, I think he would be wildly popular, and we could actually get to the bottom of what's gone on here, because it goes beyond political issue for me.
And I think I should just note here, too, this evening we heard from the administration that they're going to hold off on paying $259 million to Minnesota in funding for Medicaid because of concerns around fraud, right? So he goes from talking about it last night and then today, additional action there. Chris, we just have about a minute left here. Do you have any additional thoughts on this messaging around fraud and how it might play out over the next few months?
I think that this is obviously something that the Republicans have decided that they want to focus on. I think we saw sort of the difficulties of that when Pam Bondi was before the Senate, when Keith Ellison was then before a committee. That this is something that I think is I think it would be really hard to see that really nationalizing in a away and like bluntly, and this is my own bias against what I've seen happen whenever JD Vance is in charge of something, but I don't think anybody who wants to see the administration get a win out of this should be comforted by the fact that JD Vance is at the front of it. He has really only been put at the fore when they know that they're like going into a difficult situation that might not likely work out. I mean, his last press conference was defending Preddy.
All right, our time is up for tonight. I want to thank our guest. Chris Geidner is the publisher and author of Law Dork. That's a newsletter that covers legal developments from the Supreme Court to the Trump administration. And Amy Frederiksen specializes in media relations and crisis communications and is a principal for Momentum Advocacy. This conversation was produced by Carrie Dwyer. We'll be back on Monday at 8 o'clock, so we'll hope you tune in then. Thanks for listening and have a good evening.
Support comes from Healthcare for All Minnesotans Fund, working to advance a patient-focused healthcare system centered on accessible and high-quality care for all Minnesotans. Information at mnhealthplan.org.